George used to be the man who led the early morning walks around the small neighborhood where he lived. In his younger days, he loved the feeling of the cool breeze brushing against his face, the sound of shoes crunching gravel, and the crisp crackle of dry leaves underfoot. But then old age arrived not through wrinkles or silver hair, but in the moment he stood up from the sofa, felt a sudden dizziness, and realized his steps were no longer steady. It all began on what seemed like a normal morning. George woke up and got ready to take his granddaughter for a walk in the park, a weekly ritual he cherished. But that day, just a few steps in, his heart pounded, his breath quickened, and his legs felt heavy as lead. "I'm too tired today. Maybe next time," he said, and watched his granddaughter's disappointed eyes turn away. But the deeper sorrow was within him, the sorrow of a man quietly losing himself, day by day without knowing how to name it. That day, George didn't leave the house. Nor did he the next day. The steps he once took pride in had become a source of fear. He began sitting more, walking less. The armchair in the living room where he watched TV, drank tea, and took afternoon naps slowly became his closest companion. But George knew all too well, it was also the sweet trap of old age. One late afternoon, he sat watching his granddaughter playing in the yard. She laughed, ran, free and innocent like the wind. Suddenly, she ran up to him and asked, "Grandpa, do you still go for walks? You used to walk really fast." Her question made his throat tighten, not from wounded pride, but because he realized that child missed a version of George that he himself was starting to forget. That night, George couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, remembering the roads he used to walk, the times he walked to think, to breathe, to feel alive. "I need to start again," he told himself. But this time, not to compete with anyone, not to be like he used to be, but to hold on to himself, to hold on to the feeling of still being in control of his legs, still connected to the world through each step. The next morning, he laced up his sneakers, the pair that had sat untouched in the closet for nearly a year. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't set goals. He simply stepped outside, one small lap around the garden. Slow, short, tiring, but not discouraging. The next day, he went out again. A few more steps, a few more minutes. By the second week, he was walking around the whole block. George didn't boast. He didn't tell anyone. But his body knew. His mind knew. The stiff muscles began to soften. His breathing became less shallow. And most importantly, the feeling of not being helpless, a feeling old age often quietly plants in one's heart, began to fade. Then one Sunday morning, when his granddaughter came to visit, George smiled and said, "Want to go for a walk with me? But this time, I'm not sitting on the park bench." The child squealed with joy, grabbed his hand, and they walked together. Not fast, not far, but it was the walk of two generations, one just beginning to walk, the other not ready to stop. Older people don't need to run. They don't need to do anything extraordinary. Just keeping their steps each day is already a victory, because as long as you can still walk, you are still connected to life, still in control, still present in this world in your own way. Walking isn't just exercise. It's a quiet declaration. I'm still here, I'm still moving forward. Don't wait until you need a cane to start thinking about stepping outside. Start today, even if it's just 5 minutes, even if it's just a short stretch of pavement. Don't underestimate the value of steady footsteps, because each step is a reminder you are alive, you are strong, and you can still change yourself bit by bit. If you are on the journey of returning to the habit of walking, if you've stopped because of fatigue, laziness, or fear, but today you want to try stepping outside once more, then leave a number 1 in the comments. Share your little story. Because who knows, the very steps you are taking might just inspire someone else who is struggling with themselves. You're not alone on this journey. George did it. I believe you can too. Grace used to be a woman with a sweet tooth, a passion for butter, and an intense dislike for green vegetables. She laughed whenever someone talked about healthy eating, because to her, old age was meant for enjoying life, not restricting it like in her younger years. "I've lived long enough to earn the right to eat whatever I like," she would often say, whenever someone advised her to eat more sensibly. Every morning for Grace began with a buttered scone drenched in honey, a strong black coffee, and sometimes a crumbly cookie made from her mother's old recipe. "Eat for joy," she'd say. "As long as it still tastes good, I'm still young." But then one day everything changed, not because of a sharp pain, not because of an emergency hospital visit, just a routine annual checkup. The doctor looked at her test results, then looked at her gently but seriously. "Your liver is overworked," he said. "If you don't change your eating habits, in a few years this won't just be about numbers on a report." Grace wasn't afraid, but she started to feel uneasy. Not because of illness, but because she feared losing the freedom to enjoy the food she loved. And deeper than that was a feeling she had never faced before. Her body was speaking up, and she had been ignoring it for far too long. That evening, she went home, opened the fridge, looked at the pre-packaged meals, the cakes she had prepared for the weekend, and didn't touch a thing. She made a cup of hot tea and sat quietly on the sofa. In her heart, a question echoed, "Can I eat differently and still feel happy?" The next morning, she tried something she never had before. Lightly steamed broccoli, mashed with potatoes, sprinkled with chia seeds. It looked bland, didn't smell great, not very appealing, but she ate it slowly without forcing herself, as if getting to know a stranger. Then she went for a walk, and that afternoon she felt lighter, not in weight, but in mind. A few days later, she tried kale, and then steamed carrots, then an apple cider vinaigrette salad she once mocked as rabbit food. Strangely, her taste buds seemed to be relearning how to feel. Meals were no longer a chase for pleasure, but became a moment to listen to her body. Not too full, not greasy, just enough. 2 weeks later, she went for a checkup again, just to check her blood pressure, because her head felt unusually clear. The doctor looked at her, surprised. "Your skin looks brighter. Your eyes have more life." And it was true. Grace no longer felt sluggish and after lunch, no longer woke up with a heavy belly, no longer got tired just from climbing a few steps. No miracles, no supplements, just the quiet change of carefully chosen meals. Once her daughter came to visit, looked at her lunch plate, and burst out laughing. "Mom, what are you eating? Is this really my mother?" Grace smiled. She didn't feel mocked, she felt victorious. She had overcome a long-standing belief that healthy eating was miserable, boring, a joyless sacrifice. One day at a retirement group gathering, someone asked her, "What's your secret to looking so well?" She took a sip of warm water and said without hesitation, "I don't diet. I just eat to feel good in the way my body needs, not the way I'm used to." For Grace, vegetables were no longer the enemy. They had become new friends, sometimes simple like boiled cabbage, sometimes vibrant like a colorful salad she just learned from an online video. Meals were no longer a reward nor a punishment. They were a way of living, a way of loving herself. And strangely, as she ate lighter foods, her mind also felt lighter. She no longer felt the urge to eat while she still could, but rather felt she was choosing to eat in order to keep living well and fully. Old age doesn't have to be a time of giving up habits, nor does it mean obsessively chasing healthy trends. Sometimes it's just about trying again a food you used to dislike, trying a spoonful of veggie soup, trying a meal without sugar or butter, and listening to what your body says. You don't have to give up all sweets. You don't have to go vegan. You just need to choose each day one thing to change, one small thing to add, one vegetable, one root, one sip of water instead of soda, and see how your body responds. If you have ever thought like Grace that good food is the key to a long life, maybe try this new perspective. Eating right is the key to joyful living and living long enough to enjoy even more food. If you're beginning to change your eating habits after 60, even if it's just reducing salt, drinking more water, or trying a new vegetable, leave a number 2 in the comments. Because I want to know you're listening to yourself. And maybe someone who sees your number 2 will find the motivation to begin too. We don't need to eat like the young. We just need to eat like people who know what we've been through and who want to go a little further in strength and fullness and enjoy. Edward is now 79 years old. Once a literature teacher, he loved words, loved poetry, and loved how language could warm the quiet spaces in the human heart. In the early years of retirement, Edward lived peacefully with his joys reading, tending to his garden, and jotting down a few diary entries each day. But then something small happened, small yet startling. He forgot the name of a former student, someone he had once written a glowing recommendation letter for, to a prestigious university. How strange, he had thought. That name used to be so familiar. It was tied to a whole summer of memories. But no matter how hard he searched his mind, all he could see were blurry images, indistinct and fading. He brushed it off. Then, a few weeks later, during a family dinner, he mixed up the names of his youngest and eldest grandchildren. The family laughed it off, but Edward did not. He sat in silence for a moment, because for a man who loved language, who cherished memory, forgetting was a sorrow without a name. Memory for Edward had once been a treasure trove, but now it was slowly being covered by the dust of time. He began to worry not about illness, but about the feeling of losing a part of who he was. He had once read that after the age of 70, the brain needs daily exercise, just like muscles. If not used, it grows lazy. If not stimulated, it falls asleep. That evening after dinner, Edward pulled out his old notebook, a brown leather-bound journal he had kept for nearly a decade. On the first page was a quote from Victor Hugo he had once written in blue ink. "When you read, you live another life." He smiled, his hands trembling slightly. He turned the pages, rediscovering old notes, and he made a decision. He would return to books, like returning to an old friend who had never let him down. The next morning, Edward chose a small book. Not a long novel, just a collection of short stories he used to read to his students. He read a sentence, then paused, wrote a thought in his journal. One short line. "This story feels like me trying to find my way back to myself." Each day, he read one page. No rush, just one page followed by a few lines of reflection. Some days, only one sentence. "Today, my mind feels clearer than yesterday." And so he continued, day after day. Soon after, he started playing word games with his 7-year-old granddaughter. "What's something I love that starts with the letter T?" he asked. She squealed, "Tails!" They both laughed, their voices ringing through the little room where soft morning light filtered through cream-colored curtains. Edward began writing down what he remembered each day. Names of old students, familiar lines of poetry, paragraphs he'd read decades ago. At first, it was jumbled. But after a few weeks, his memory seemed to unravel itself. Fragments returned, uninvited. They came like old friends, knocking gently, sitting beside him without a word of blame. One weekend afternoon, his son came by. As they sat drinking tea, Edward recounted an old story about the time he led a class field trip into the forest, got lost, and had the whole class sing in unison so he could follow their voices back. His son stared in surprise. "I've never heard that story before. How do you still remember it so clearly?" Edward smiled, eyes sparkling. "Because I wrote it down last week." He realized then that remembering is not just a skill, it's a choice. When you choose to care, to write, to read, memory doesn't abandon you. It only waits for you to return. Reading doesn't restore memory overnight, but it keeps the mind alive, breathing, connected. Each page is a small challenge for the brain, a reminder that you are still here, still thinking, still feeling, still remembering. Edward didn't need to read high philosophy. Some days he read an old letter from his late wife. Some days it was a short article in a farming magazine. The content didn't matter. What mattered was that his eyes were still following words, and his heart was still stirred by the simplest thoughts. Since he began reading regularly again, Edward also slept better, less tossing and turning. He woke up feeling sharper. He no longer feared forgetfulness or felt out of control. He was regaining ownership of his memory line by line. Memory in old age is not guaranteed, but it can be nurtured by living slowly, deeply, and with connection. If you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, and you find yourself forgetting more, don't be afraid. Start with a page, a journal entry, a meaningful conversation. Keep your mind engaged like tending a garden. Water it with words, shade it with emotions, and watch as a new branch of memory blossoms, reminding you that you are still young in your own way. If you are rereading an old book, journaling, or writing down what you remember each day, leave a number 3 in the comments. Because I want to know you're still here, still using words to preserve your memory and your freedom. We can't stop time, but we can walk with it with a book in hand and a mind still tended with love for knowledge. Helen is now 76 years old. A meticulous woman, she lived with order and had long grown accustomed to handling everything in the house by herself. But one morning, just like any other, as she bent down to retrieve a slipper from under the bed, she lost her balance and fell. It wasn't a serious injury, but from that moment on, something emerged within her, something that hadn't existed in all her decades of life: fear. The fall didn't hurt as much as the helplessness of not being able to get up on her own. She had to sit on the floor and call out loudly for her grandson downstairs to come help. When he opened the door and looked at her with eyes full of worry and care, Helen felt more ashamed than sad. She had once been so strong. She had carried the family on her back after her husband passed away. She had gone to the market alone, lugging heavy bags without a single complaint. And now, just one bend, and it turned into a fall. From that day on, Helen limited her movements. Bending over, climbing stairs, turning around, everything made her feel fragile. And the most dangerous part wasn't in her legs, but in her mind. When we start telling ourselves, "I can't," that very sentence can stop our steps even when nothing is truly broken. She didn't talk much about the fall. She hid it, like hiding a scratch on her pride. But the fear became clearer with each passing day. She no longer enjoyed going out, didn't want to shop alone, no longer stood in the kitchen for long. And at night, she tossed and turned, wondering, am I becoming dependent? One day during a meetup with her old friend Rose, who was the same age Helen, quietly shared the story of her fall. Rose smiled gently and said, "I've been through that too. But then I started training again, just 5 stand sits from a chair each day and a few light wall pushes. Not to be as strong as when I was young, but to feel like I'm still in control of my own body." Helen listened without replying, but in her heart, a glimmer of light appeared. That evening, she tried. She stood up from her chair, then sat back down slowly. It was hard. Her knees creaked, her back was stiff, her arms weak, but she kept going. No pressure, no goal, just trying again. The next day, she did it again. It felt slightly easier. A week later, she could stand up and sit down 10 times without using her hands. 2 weeks later, she carried a laundry basket outside without asking her grandson for help. And one afternoon, as she stood organizing items on a high kitchen shelf, she realized her back was straighter, her knees firmer, and her heart lighter. No one in the house knew she was training. She didn't want to show off. To her, this wasn't about regaining form, but a quiet journey to reclaim lost confidence. One morning, while watering plants in the yard, Helen found herself standing on one leg to reach a hanging pot. As she stepped down, she froze. I just balanced on one leg? A small thing, but for her, it was a triumph. Since starting her gentle exercises, Helen was no longer afraid to bend. She began climbing stairs slowly without holding onto the railing or wall. She felt each muscle group coming back. Her body, like a machine left unused for too long, just needed the right oiling, and it ran again. Once, her granddaughter said, "Grandma, why are you walking so fast these days?" Helen smiled but didn't answer. In her heart, she knew. It wasn't that she was faster, it was that she no longer walked in fear. When a person regains balance not just in the legs, but in the mind, they walk more steadily, even if the road ahead is uneven. Helen is still a 76-year-old woman with silver hair and age spots on her hands. But now, when she steps out the door, she carries something more precious than youth. It's the feeling of being in command of her body. It's independence. The strength of old age isn't about how many kilograms you can lift. It's about whether you can rise from a chair without fear, whether you dare to take a walk alone without anxiety, whether you can squat to pick herbs without needing someone to pull you up. If you're beginning the journey to regain your balance, even if it's just standing on one leg each day or gently pushing against a wall, leave a number 4 in the comments. Share a bit about the small exercises you're doing with perseverance, because even the smallest effort is a declaration that you are not surrendering to aging. You are learning to live actively in your own body. Helen fell, but she didn't stay down in fear. She got back up with her own legs and her own will. And I believe if you've read this far, you can do the same bit by bit, day by day. After days of gradually regaining her physical strength, Helen began to notice another kind of emptiness in her life, a nameless void that echoed every time the house became too quiet. She had found her balance again, walked more steadily, stood up and sat down without support. But after each solitary meal, after watering the plants, after going through the same motions day after day, she still found herself waiting for a call, waiting for a message, waiting for someone to knock on the door. Helen had children and grandchildren, a family, but everyone was busy. Her son worked in finance, coming home only to dive back into more work. Her grandchildren had school, and at home, they were glued to phones or the television. No one did anything wrong, no one was neglectful. It was just different rhythms of life, and the silences between them stretched longer with each passing day. One rainy afternoon, Helen sat by the window, watching raindrops roll down the glass, listening to the steady patter of the rain. She suddenly realized it had been 2 weeks since anyone called her just to check in. All the recent calls had been from the bank, her doctor, or annoying advertisements. And worse, she hadn't called anyone either. The sorrow of old age doesn't stem from occasional loneliness, but from the sense that you are gradually becoming invisible. No one calls, and you don't know who to call. That day, she pulled out an old address book. Inside were names of childhood friends, a few former colleagues, and the phone number of the women's club at the local community center. She stared at the numbers, hesitant. Then she dialed one Rose, the friend who had once encouraged her to practice standing up and sitting down months ago. Rose answered, her voice bright and cheerful. "Helen, I was just thinking about you. It's been so long since you called." They talked for nearly an hour, about the old days, their grandchildren, and sleep patterns. When they hung up, Helen smiled. It had been a long time since a conversation made her feel so present. The next morning, she did something bold. She went to the community center. At first, she only stood outside watching. A group of elderly women sat knitting, laughing, chatting warmly. She looked at them with a hint of envy, not because they were skilled, but because they had one another. The following week, she returned this time, stepping inside. She sat quietly in a corner, observing, until someone invited her to join the table. A woman handed her a skein of pale blue yarn. "Want to give it a try?" she asked. Helen nodded. Her hands trembled slightly, but her heart felt warm. After that first knitting session, she returned home with a small, unfinished scarf. She placed it on the table and felt an unfamiliar joy, not because of the object itself, but because she had something to talk about, an afternoon to remember, someone to return to next time who might ask, "How far along are you with your knitting?" From then on, every Wednesday, Helen went to the knitting club. The air was lively, full of laughter and simple stories. No one asked what job you had, how much you made. They only asked, "How are you feeling today? Did you sleep well last night? Have you tried this new pattern?" She began to feel part of the world again. Not the bustling world outside, but a more intimate one, where a glance, a small question, a smile was enough to ease the weight of an entire day. Strangely, from the day she started knitting, people began calling her again. Not because she waited, but because she had created reasons for others to remember her. Her granddaughter called, "Grandma, I told my friend you're knitting a scarf." Her son asked, "Can you send me a picture of that scarf you're working on?" And then Helen herself started calling others. Not because she needed anything, just to check in. An old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. A cousin she used to be close to. Just a few minutes of conversation reminded her. Everyone is craving connection. They just don't always dare to be the first. Old age isn't as frightening as withdrawal, not because we're left behind, but because we retreat into silence and then blame others for not reaching out. Helen no longer waited for someone to call. She began calling. Not because someone told her to, not for some grand reason. She called to hear a familiar voice. Called to know that out there someone was listening to her and that she too was listening. If you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, and you've noticed that fewer people are calling, try being the one to call first. Call an old friend, call a neighbor, call your local community center and ask about their schedule. Don't wait for others to remember you. Be the one who rekindles the connection. And if you've ever stepped out of loneliness by reconnecting with others, even if just through a knitting session or a friendly call, leave a number 5 in the comments. Because I believe that everyone who shares their number 5 is part of weaving invisible but unbreakable threads connecting us, stitch by quiet stitch, into a warm scarf for the winter of old age. George had never thought of sleep as something that needed protection. All his life, he had slept easily. When he was younger, he could sleep anywhere, on the sofa in the middle of the day, on an overnight train during business trips, or on quiet, rainy afternoons by the window. For George, sleep was simple, natural, something that came and went like breath. But at 74, everything changed. At first, it was just restless nights. He'd stay awake until nearly 2 a.m., his eyes wide open. Some nights, he would fall asleep only to wake up at 3 a.m. and find himself unable to drift back off. It felt like his body was there, but his mind was floating somewhere else, tired, empty. Worse yet, when morning came, he didn't feel rested. His body was sluggish, his thoughts hazy, his limbs weak. I haven't done anything strenuous, George thought. Why am I this tired? His wife, Margaret, had passed away many years ago. George had grown used to living alone, sticking to his old routines. He still had dinner at 7, watched the news at 8, and went to bed at 10:30. But now, even though everything remained the same, sleep no longer came easily. One night, he woke at 3:17 a.m. No pain, no dream, no noise. Just a quiet awakening, and then he couldn't go back to sleep. He lay still, listening to the ticking clock, feeling every passing second like a reminder of age slowly eroding him. He tossed and turned, closed his eyes, counted, breathed deeply. None of it worked. Near dawn, he finally dozed off a bit, but when he woke, it felt as though he'd never slept at all. George began to fear the night. Not the darkness, but the vast stretch of time between 2 and 5 a.m. That silent void no one talks about, but everyone who's been through it knows too well. He didn't tell anyone, not out of shame, but because he thought sleepless nights come with age. Everyone has them. But then during a checkup, George quietly asked the doctor, "I don't drink coffee after 4. I don't use my phone at night, so why can't I sleep?" The doctor looked at him gently and said, "Maybe it's not that your body isn't ready for sleep. Maybe your mind hasn't been given permission to rest." That sentence stayed with George. He realized that every night before bed, he would still watch the news, scroll through a few articles, and ruminate on things that worried him. Rising medication prices, climate change, or the fact that his grandchildren seemed to call less often. Each small thought was like a pebble tossed into a still pond, rippling through his mind long after the lights went out. George decided to try something different. Instead of watching the news, he brewed a warm cup of ginger tea. He turned off the lights half an hour earlier. He sat in the soft glow of a lamp, doing nothing, just sitting, listening to the clock, to the wind brushing the rooftop. Then he picked up an old book, not a heavy one, just a collection of short stories. He read one, no need to learn anything from it, no conclusions, just reading as a way to return his mind to quiet. That night, George slept until 5 a.m. Not a long sleep, not uninterrupted. But when he woke, his head felt lighter, his heart beat more even. Not youthful, but enough to feel, this body, even aged, can still recover, if loved the right way. From that night on, he created a sleep ritual. Lights out early, no phone in the room, soft piano music, warm tea, a few pages of a book. These small habits, simple as they were, became his way of signaling to his body, it's time to rest now. After a few weeks, George slept better. And the surprising thing was, it wasn't just the sleep that improved, his mood did too. He was less irritable, less forgetful, and most importantly, no longer afraid of the night. Sleep, he realized, was not the leftover part of the day. It was the most essential part. Like tending soil after harvest, the body too needs to be loosened, simplified, relieved of all the worries it had gathered throughout the day. George shared this experience during a seniors group meeting at the community center. Many nodded, saying, "I've had trouble sleeping too," but had never considered preparing for sleep as something that mattered. He said, "I used to think sleep was automatic, but now I see it as a gift, and I want to be awake and clear-minded enough during the day to deserve that gift each night." If you're struggling with sleep, if you wake in the middle of the night unsure of what to do, try this. Don't reach for your phone. Don't force yourself to fall back asleep. Just sit up, breathe gently, drink something warm, listen to the night, write a few lines. That's not insomnia, it's your body asking to be comforted. If you've tried something, music, a book, a cup of warm tea that helped even a little, leave a number 6 in the comments. Let me know you're here too, walking the same path to reclaim your sleep, not to stretch out your years, but to be fully alive in each morning you rise. Sleep is not the end of a day. It is how the next one truly begins. Old age is not a destination. It's a turning point, a place where you can choose to slow down, go deeper, and if you're gentle enough with yourself, discover a beauty greater than any chapter that came before. We've just walked through 6 habits, 6 small but steady steps to live healthier, more independently, and more peacefully in the later years of life. There was George, the man who began again with one small step each morning, only to rediscover an entire youth in every healthy heartbeat. There was Grace, who once saw eating as a right to indulge, until she realized that eating right is not about giving things up, but about loving herself more deeply. There was Edward, who held on to memory through old books, finding vibrance in every line he read each day. There was Helen, who fell once, but rose not with her legs, but with quiet determination, so that every step afterward became a declaration. I am still in control of my body. Also Helen, from another angle, who stopped waiting for someone to call and instead picked up the phone herself, reconnecting with the world, one relationship, one familiar laugh at a time. And finally, George again, the man who learned how to sleep once more, not with pills, not through force, but through honoring the gift that each day leaves behind, a peaceful night's rest. 6 stories, 6 lives, 6 ways of being, but all sharing one truth. They did not let old age define them. They didn't wait to be taken care of. They chose to live actively, kindly, and fully, every single day. Old age doesn't need to be loud, just steady. It doesn't need to be young again, just clear with oneself. To know what you can still own, what you still wish to do, and how you can still change, even if just a little each day. Today, maybe you can start with one small thing, one gentle step, one meal with less sugar and more greens, one passage read slowly, one time rising without grabbing the chair, one intentional phone call, one warm glass of water before bed. You don't have to do them all. Just choose one. One small thing to do kindly each day. Because health doesn't come from a magic cure. It comes from steady kindness toward yourself. If you've made it this far, leave a comment and share what touched you most. And if you're beginning a small change in your aging journey, write it down there so I and others know you are not alone. The journey to healthy aging doesn't start with a prescription. It begins with one simple question. What can I do today to care for myself with love? Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next videos where we'll keep walking this path, quietly and steadily toward an old age, not just long, but beautiful and free.